Good evening, everybody. I am Congressman Sean Casten. I thank you for joining us tonight. We have a really terrific panel of experts. One of the many privileges of my job is you get access to experts who are way smarter on topics than I am. Unfortunately, Dr. Chang had a minor but urgent medical procedure she had to take care of, so she is not here tonight. But we will be joined by Professor Anna Guevarra, who has agreed to pinch hit for her on short notice. Professor Guevarra is the founding director of the Global Asian Studies program at University of Illinois, Chicago. And I'm going to keep these introductions short so that we can focus on questions, but suffice to say, all these people have lengthy bios. We are also going to be joined by David Goldenberg, who is the Midwest Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League and oversees the organization's work in Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. Hopefully I got that all right. And Andy Kang, who is the Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Chicago. We will run through all of those in a moment. Before we get started, I wanted to talk about why we're doing this. I think, as anybody who's been following the news is well aware, there has been a rise in hate crimes generally over the last few years. There's been a rise in groups that are preaching hatred and violence. And since January, there's been a significant uptick in hate crimes and hate incidents. Not all of these are crimes, but hate incidents as well towards the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Now, I emphasize Asian American and Pacific Islander because for better or for worse, while a lot of this has been driven by COVID and the channeling of this as somehow China's fault, more often than not, the average person committing a hate crime doesn't know the difference between someone who may be Chinese, maybe Korean, maybe Japanese, and so there's a lot of folks who have nothing to do with China. Not that that's deserving otherwise, but that has happened. Now, the fact that this has started increasing since January is not entirely coincidental, because that's been the rise in coronavirus, and it has been the rise in some fairly toxic speech coming out of senior political leaders' mouths that has brandished this as the Chinese virus or worse, and has essentially exaggerated that hatred. And look, I'm under no illusions. The overwhelming majority of Americans, the overwhelming majority of people in this district are good people. Love has got the numbers. Love has always got the numbers. But sometimes love's too quiet. And when hatred gets loud, if we don't stand up, we have too many incidents in our history of what happens when you don't stand up when hatred starts getting loud. And so it's important for us to talk about it. It's important for us to acknowledge it. And it is important for those of us who are in the majority, who are good and fundamentally decent people, to stand up to this when we see it, either to act as bystanders who are enabled to redress for it, or to call it out, or to do things like this and let people be educated. So thank you all for participating. Just a few words on the politics of this before we dive in. Number one, just two things to state the obvious. The coronavirus did indeed originate in China, did indeed originate in Wuhan. And that's about as relevant as knowing that a real bad tornado in Illinois originated in Iowa. Okay, that's where it came from. Viruses don't really care about national borders. There are pandemic teams that have been studying viruses for a long time, have been concerned about the coronavirus as a class, because it has the ability both to spread through influenza, to spread as an aerosol, and as a virus that can migrate from humans to people. And there are a lot of channels that could happen, but it happened to come from China. It could have come from any number of places, but it is true that that's where it originated. It is equally true that in the early days of this, the Chinese Communist government did suppress information. I think most famously, and I'm always going to mispronounce these names, but Dr. Li Wenliang, who was the first scientist to notice that there was this virus that seemed to be problematic. It was coming from the SARS family of viruses, and the government initially essentially attempted to squelch that down. Now, they changed their tune after a few weeks, but they did indeed initially suppress that virus. And we know that because it was reported in the papers. We also know that because Around about the same time, our own intelligence agencies were advising the president through his presidential daily brief that there were things not to trust about the Chinese government, which we knew for a long time. The Vietnamese government was also aware of that. The Vietnamese government took actions to really clamp down because they knew from their own intelligence agencies what to trust, what not to trust. South Korean governments did the same thing. They acted. We didn't act in our country as quickly as possible. And so it's true that there is a significant concern when any government, I don't care where it is, when any government suppresses information, that if that information was released would be conducive to public health. But we got to clean up our own house before we before we start throwing stones. And none of that has anything to do with people who happen to share some historic genetic linkage with people who also share a historic genetic linkage with the Chinese Communist government. So with that as an overview, let me now start by introducing, and I've got to be a little bit of MC here, so I apologize as I bounce back. I want to introduce Grant, who is on the telephone. And Grant is a Naperville resident and a constituent, and can speak a little bit to just some things that have happened to him and experiences. And Grant, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. Again, my name is Grant. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm going to share the story, but before that, I would like to just telling everyone who I am, how long I have been in this country, what I have done, just to give you guys a little bit of background of an average Chinese American who have lived in this country. And after sharing the story, I also going to make a couple of comments, and also I will answer questions, but I will only answer questions that is related to clearing the facts. I am not going to make any political comments. With the story, you guys can make your own judgments. I came to this country in 1982 for graduate study. I got my master's degree from Virginia Tech in engineering. And since then, I have moved to several places, 5 states. I lived in 5 states. I visited many places for both business and the pleasure. In 1991, I moved to Naperville, Illinois. Have lived in there since. And I raised, my wife and I raised 3 children, 1 daughter. She is 30 years old, 31 years old, currently a medical doctor in New York City. And she and her husband have been working with the COVID patients in both the COVID units and also in ER rooms. They have been telling me a lot of stories, but I think I am very concerned of the situation they are in, along with many other people. But yet at the same time, I have to say they have been very brave, very professional, and very proud of both of them. And I have 2 18-year-old boys, twin boys. They are graduating from high school. They will be heading to college. One is going to Princeton in the fall. The other one is going to Berkeley, California, UC Berkeley. So we have been living in this community. We have, I'm not going to kind of brag and say I am a contributor, but at least we have been doing the best we can to bring our children to productive members to the society. And also on the side, I have also started a business in 1990 doing export and sold the equipment to China, to municipal water plant, power plant, and all that. So that is pretty much who I am. Oh, by the way, I am retired, semi-retired now, and doing drawings at home and gardening, woodworking, and running. And what happened on 21st of March is related to running. I've been running for almost 15, 16 years. And this is the trail I have ran on for many, many times. I have never had any problem. On 21st of March, I did, as all other days, did a 10-mile run, but on the way back, about 2 miles from my house, I saw two ladies in front of me, one tall, one shorter. And so I tried to give as much distance between me and them. So I moved all the way to the left, stay on the trail, but move all the way to the left. But the corner of my eye, I saw the taller lady went off the trail, went into the grass, and started reaching for something in the grass. And as I was just passing them, she started swinging it from left to right. And then I just felt something hit my right thigh on the back. So I stopped and I asked her, I said, "Why did you do that?" She started pointing up with her hands and also looking up. And I followed her hands. I saw nothing about this. And I saw a big branch about 3 feet long and a 2-inch diameter laying in the middle of the trail. So I told her, I said, "No, did not fall on me. You swung at me." And she started screaming and saying all kinds of things. And most of the things I don't care about repeating. But she did say that you coughed at me without covering your mouth. So I said, "Well, I do not realize I did that. But if I did, I apologize." But she started just keep on screaming at me, including you are a sick person, including go back to China, and a lot of other things, and also she spat at me. I thought about calling police at that time, honestly, but since I was not exactly injured, she hit me, but I was not injured. So I decided not to call the police at that time. I kept moving on and I went home. As I got home, I saw my boys in the living room, and then made me more concerned. Thinking of them and my daughter, I was concerned if they were under the same circumstance, if they encounter something similar to that, how would they handle it? Would they be able to avoid worse? So I decided to call the police then. And I have to say that the police officers I worked with from the
Grant, can you still hear us? We may be losing your connection.
police department, they were very, very professional. I don't, they did more than I expected. They have been very.
Hey, Grant, we may have lost you. I don't know if you're walking around. Grant, can you hear us okay? I'll tell you what, we'll see if Grant can rejoin us. I think unfortunately we've all got this experience in this moment right now of going through this, but let's see if Grant can rejoin us, or maybe some of the folks on the doing the IT in the back can get him a better connection. Let us turn over to Professor Guevarra, if you are here, to share your background and know some of the some of your sort of historical lessons and similar points in our history.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I apologize. It looks like my webcam is not working, so you cannot see me. I can see all of you. I wanted to just thank Representative Casten for this invitation, but and also my co-panelists. I truly appreciate having this opportunity to have this conversation with all of you. I cannot give a long history, so I promise I will limit my comments. And this is a very abbreviated history of the moment. And what I wanted to primarily focus on is a couple of points. One is that there has been and has always been a long history of anti-Asian racism, xenophobia, and anti-immigrant sentiments and in the United States. And so what we are seeing today in light of COVID-19 is not new. These sentiments often happen in, are reflected in moments of crisis, whether it's public health, economic or political crises. And we have seen how destructive those sentiments can be. And so I wanted to highlight just a couple of moments in history, and I'm sorry that you cannot see my slides. I can forward it later to participants if that is of interest to anybody. So what I wanted to say is that we have always in the United States experienced the racialization of pandemics and epidemics. And we saw this in the latter end of the 19th century up until the 20th century, where we see immigrants and so-called foreign bodies be identified as the culprit for pandemics. There have been a number of cases of the foreign and the immigrant body being blamed for diseases. And I just limit my examples to the impact on the Chinese communities in particular, and the ways in which they have, they have been used as medical scapegoats. There were a couple of things I wanted to highlight, which you can't visualize here, but there were a number of advertisements floating around in the late 19th century, where which promoted very common racist myths that diseases were rampant in Chinatowns. So diseases like leprosy, smallpox, etc., and those being attributed to the presence of the Chinese. There were a number of advertisements that pointed to the so-called Orient and the Chinese in particular to have diseased bodies that are always concealing or being concealed as they work, as laborers, as coffee attendants, laundrymen, etc. And so we see these kinds of, racialization of pandemics, rampant during this period, and we see them lead to consequential results. And one consequence that I want to highlight took place in the advent of the bubonic plague that happened in 1899 to 1900. In 1899, in Honolulu's Chinatown, which was home to approximately 3,000 Chinese, 1,500 Japanese, and 1,000 Native Hawaiians, public health officials responded to the bubonic plague by, in three ways. One was they placed Chinatown residents in quarantine. They placed armed guards stationed to control the movement of Chinatown residents. And unfortunately, they also resorted to burning down buildings where plague victims resided. So in 1900, we saw this, particular fire grow out of control, which consumed a fifth of Honolulu's buildings and decimated the homes of 5,000 residents. And the guarding of this area became so grave, and also the racist attacks on this community so grave, became grave. And you saw this when white residents in particular, would come with baseball bats to ensure that the fire victims ended up in their very tightly controlled quarters. So you see kind of, this racism playing out, and residents enacting this racism against one another. You can also see these xenophobic racist actions stem from the perception that Asians are not, only biologically diseased, but that there's something culturally unhygienic, unsanitary about them. And you can see this in the context of, again, a number of advertisements floating during the time, and the images that I would have shown you. One was an image of an advertisement for a laundry detergent, where you see Uncle Sam kicking a figure that looks like, the so-called Chinaman figure, with with the description that if you want something clean, you don't want to use this. And so it's, again, kind of reifying this notion, suggesting that there's something dirty about the Chinese. There's also a very popular ad that some of you may have seen about a rat poison, and presumably what was being sold is a rat poison, but what you saw was a figure of a Chinese man eating a rat, and also the figure of the Chinese man akin to a rat. So suggesting, again, that not only are the Chinese possibly rat eaters, but perhaps they themselves also need to be exterminated, because they are carriers of disease, that needs to be, that needs to be gotten rid of. So reflecting these sentiments, what we then see is, this pervasive, the Chinese as a yellow peril, and this materialized in a very important legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the very first legislation to bar immigrants to come to the U.S. on the basis of race and class. It specifically—
Dr. Guevarra?
Sure.
This is Laura. I'm a member of Congressman Casten's staff. I wanted to let you know that we can actually see your screen.
Oh, you can? Okay.
We can, yes.
All right, let me show you this. Okay. Oh, that's great. So let me just show you some of the images. So this was, the image that I referred to earlier in terms of the ways in which the Chinese have been used as medical scapegoats. This was during the outbreak of the bubonic plague. This was that ad for a laundry detergent, again, depicting the ways in which the Chinese were perceived to be unhygienic, unsanitary, dirty. This an image that probably one of the more iconic images that have been, that had circulated at that time, again, representing the Chinese as, something that needs to be exterminated. And this all of these sentiments, culminated in this very important legislation that I mentioned earlier, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, that was fully put into effect in 1904 and was not repealed until 1943. And this is a very important legislation, not only because it barred immigrants on the basis of race and class, but it also laid the groundwork for the creation of federal immigrant detention centers, which would later be the same detention centers that would incarcerate and imprison and detain other immigrant bodies. So, we're seeing Asians represented as yellow peril in times of health crises, but we're also seeing them represented as yellow peril during political crises. And we saw this during the incarceration of approximately 120,000 Japanese in American concentration camps in World War II, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the Executive Order 9066 in 1942, which incarcerated anyone who's of Japanese descent. We also see the representation of Asians and Asian Americans as a yellow peril during economic crisis. And we saw this in the 1980s at the height of an economic recession and oil crisis, and the growing presence of Japan as a leading manufacturer of more fuel-efficient automobiles. Many automobile workers, specifically in Detroit, Michigan, for example, were displaced at this time. And unfortunately, then, turned to blaming Japan for the crisis, and anyone who looked Japanese, anyone who's identified to be Japanese. And unfortunately, that was the fate of Vincent Chin, who's actually was a Chinese American immigrant who was mistaken to be Japanese and became victim to two white auto workers in 1982 who murdered him because they thought that he was Japanese. And so I wanted to just point this out because it is important that what we're seeing here, what we saw with the Vincent Chin incident and in times of economic crisis, is that instead of turning to the corporations or turning to particular legislations that led to the industrialization and to the decline of the manufacturing sector in the US, what happened was a very specific targeting, or the blame was put on individual or on particular, racist rhetoric, rather than actually holding the corporations and legislations as the culprit for what was happening then. But what is also, I wanted to point out, what is also interesting with the place that Asian Americans occupy in the racial matrix of the US is that, at times we are represented as a yellow peril, but at times we're also the model minority. And this is, a particular representation, a myth that has also been consequential for Asian American communities. This is the myth that regard Asians as upwardly mobile, successful, good at math. They're the whiz kids. But what it masks is the heterogeneity in the Asian American population. So that if you actually disaggregate this population, this community by ethnicity, the demographics in terms of education, in terms of income, in terms of employment will differ across different groups. It is also important to note when Asians as model minorities was constructed in the 1960s, it was part of the plan to denigrate other communities of color, namely Black communities, and pit one racial group over another. And unfortunately, this is what we see now. Whenever the model minority myth is summoned and represented, it is often used as a way, as a racial wedge between Asians and Blacks. So what I wanted to just conclude with is kind of 3 things that I hope we can talk a little bit more about as a way to understand what is happening to Asian American communities in light of COVID-19. And one is, I think and why I appreciate being invited to this panel, I think we really do need to understand the long history of racism that has been enacted against multiple minority communities, different immigrant communities. 2, we should also understand that pandemics have always been racialized and that immigrant communities and communities of color often become a target during this moment. And before Asians, there were the Irish, the Italians, the Jews. And so it's, one group after another who often become targets. And, these are always, and oftentimes it's the immigrant communities that become the target for these racist attacks. And 3rd, I think we also need to understand that the anti-Asian racism that is playing out is, while unique to Asian American communities, it is also connected to various forms of structural racism that other communities of color are facing. So I think part of our response has to be collective in that way, and hopefully we can also have a discussion in terms of how we might be able to do that as a way to support, what is happening with Asian American communities, as a way to have some redress for what Mr. Gu has experienced and what others are experiencing, but also as a way to continue to build solidarities with other communities of color. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Guevarra. If any of you, we're going to get to questions once we get through the presentations here. If you do have questions in this format, I would ask you to please put them in the chat box, and then once we go through, if they're just for specific people, let us know in there. Just general is fine as well. But click in the chat that you can see, put your questions in, and let me now turn over to David Goldenberg at the Anti-Defamation League, and the floor is yours, David.
Great, thanks, Congressman. I'm gonna put up just a couple slides, not too many, for folks to see. Make sure that everyone can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Congressman, for having me on. My name is David Goldenberg. I'm the Midwest Regional Director of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. And for those who don't know, ADL was founded actually here in Chicago in 1913. With a dual-pronged mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to ensure fair and just treatment for all. And since then, we've grown into be a leading anti-hate organization in the US and globally. And so really appreciative for having this opportunity. ADL Center on Extremism is the leading tracker of extremism online and in real life. We track and expose and monitor extremists, their activities, as I said, online in real life, and we work to frankly thwart bad things from happening. And actually in 2019, we had more than 600 assists to law enforcement around the country. So pretty significant in the work that we do. What I wanted to try to do is I was asked to kind of talk a little bit about what COVID-19, the coronavirus, and what we're seeing from a hate perspective. And really, and looking at it from an extremist perspective and online as well. So we are seeing sort of the manifestation of hate in really 4 kind of key and core ways. Number one, we've seen an increase in online hate dramatically. As the professor said, directed toward Asian Americans, toward Jews, to other minority groups and immigrants. The second, we've saw many have heard about the phenomenon of Zoom bombing, taking over conference calls or Zoom meetings. And what began, frankly, as sort of, if, you know, we could pick it up, we may even have the apps right on our phones. And so grabbing these, and then if you also think about that children and high school students and college students and young people have access to these platforms and what it ultimately means. And here's another one. This is the most common false trope, is that the coronavirus was transferred by someone eating bat soup. And this image made its way through Reddit and Telegram again on January 31st and spread quite frequently. And so so what we see is what happens online to then some real life incidents. A number of you may be, including Grant's story, which we all must applaud the courage that he has, not only to stand up for himself in that particular instance, but the courage to share his story today, and we appreciate that. These were some incidents, in Evanston. One was at a metro station on the left, and the cartoon image on the lower right-hand side. At the pier at Northwestern University, there was an originally displayed Chinese character, and it was a rather nice and beautiful art piece that ultimately was painted over and graffiti with someone who wrote China virus. The upper right-hand corner also was a tweet that was posted and actually went fairly viral about issues that someone had on a JetBlue site. So these were starting to play a role here. And all of us here probably followed the protests in Springfield and in Chicago. And so the point that I kind of want to make here is ADL for the last 2 months has tracked well over 75 rallies around the country. And what we have been seeing in the last couple of weeks too is we see where hate and Nazi images and swastikas. The image on the left is Arbeit macht frei, is a statement that is on the outside of Auschwitz and a number of concentration camps, translated to "work will set you free." These are one of the things that we're seeing is extremists originally were the ones who were organizing this, and we've now seen, frankly, more conservative groups who have been organizing these reopen rallies around the country. But the reality is that there's ample evidence so that extremists are using it to really amplify their beliefs and their presence, and the pervasiveness and extensive media coverage that these rallies are getting, frankly, are too good of an opportunity from an extremist perspective, and it's creating these incredible platforms for them that you're starting to see play out in a lot of different ways. I talked a little bit about the Zoom bombing. ADL's following this. We're quite concerned, and from an elected official perspective, of thinking about what can be done. Certainly as colleges and schools come back into session in the fall, we've got to be cognizant that we're protecting individuals, because the things that we see is quite concerning. So with that, I wanted to offer, just in conclusion, a couple things. Number one, we would encourage people to flag posts on social media. You can report them. You can report incidents to us here at ADL. You can speak out online. You can speak out against these things. You can educate yourself, and you can support targeted communities. It's really important because all of us have a role in fighting back. So I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Now I'm going to turn over to Andy Kang to share your background and work, and particularly this concerning trend in targeting Asian Americans. Turn over to you, and once again, once Andy has concluded, we'll have just a brief discussion and open up to questions. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat room, wherever your format is. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Congressman, and thank you to you and your team for having the foresight to pull together this conversation. It's very timely, and I appreciate everything that has been shared by the other panelists. I thought I would start with, and I want to just confirm that folks can see my slideshow screen. So I thought I would pick up where Dr. Guevarra maybe left off. One more ism, in this case, a phobia of sorts, that will give us some framework of what we're looking at right now. Dr. Guevarra talked about a lot of the historical patterns that we've seen, just even in Asian American history. And it generally always starts with something, an economic downturn, a crisis, right? A shortage of jobs, what have you, that translates then into political rhetoric, right? Some scapegoating, in particular of a particular Asian community. And that usually escalates into hate incidents and violence, sometimes on the individual level, but sometimes larger. And then sadly, oftentimes in our history, that'll translate into actual government policies that unfortunately are a bit of black marks in our nation's history. Whether we talk about the Japanese American incarceration during World War II, we talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which then post that additional laws were put in place, like the Immigration Act of 1924, which banned all immigration from Asia, which and that stayed in place for quite some time. And so I thought I would pick something a little more recent, which is 9/11. So, you know, I've been unfortunately reading the news like many of you. My affiliation, we have affiliates in DC, LA, San Francisco, and Atlanta. We have a hate tracker as well that is in different Asian languages at standagainsthatred.org. And we've unfortunately seen an uptick in reported incidents. And you know, I'm trying to get a better sense of what should we expect, not only for this next year, but, you know, for the foreseeable future based on this pattern. Also seeing a lot of the rhetoric that is in our political discourse these days, if you could call it that. And I thought the people that I should be talking to in my community are the Muslim American community that have been dealing with this for quite some time. And what they have told me about their experience post 9/11 with the rise in rhetoric, but also hate incidents, is that we should expect that this is not going to go away in year 1 or year 2, that this might be with us for a while. And so, you know, I wish I could have better news, but I think it's really important for us to, you know, psychologically and emotionally understand that this is not something that's going to go away by not paying attention to it, or that we can just hope that it'll fade after the shelter order is lifted by the governor. This is likely something that's going to be with us for a little bit, right? And I really love what the congressman said at the beginning, that the answer is for us to show more love in response to this hate. And, you know, I'm a churchgoer on Sunday mornings, and I'm constantly reminded that love is not just a feeling, right? It requires action, right? It requires some affirmative level of reaching out to other people to let them know they're not alone, right? That we're in this together. And I think a lot of what I've been seeing is a lot of people embracing that ethos. And I hope that you know, we can really move towards that. So as I mentioned, yeah, as you'll see that, you know, over the years, the number of hate incidents, at least the ones that the FBI can track, have not actually diminished. They've actually increased for the Muslim American community. So you know, one way of thinking about it is, as the shelter order at some point will be lifted by the governor, and here Mayor Lightfoot in the city of Chicago, there will be more opportunities for human interaction. Many of you, your kids will be going back to school. You know, Mr. Gu shared his phenomenal whiz kids in that instance. They, you know, somewhat are the model minority. They'll be going to college, and as there's increased opportunities for human interaction, we do expect there'll be also increased chances of, unfortunately, hate incidents. And so we want to be mindful of that as we think about this. Now, one of the other things that I would point out about what's happening now is we are seeing the political rhetoric. And I'm going to lift up some examples just so that we're all very clear that while in this instance, the majority of this is coming from one particular political party, you know, Dr. Guevarra pointed out the murder of Vincent Chin, which happened in Detroit. A lot of the political rhetoric around that time and the failing auto industry was from Democrats, because Michigan was a very Democrat-heavy town, right? And people were looking to scapegoat somebody. So, you know, I think we just want to be clear that this is not necessarily something that is only a problem for one political party. Over time, that can evolve and change. What is important that we were really clear on who's saying what, right? And so what we have here is a couple examples. I try to keep up to date with the president's tweets, but this is from March 18th. But also, the president on his own is not just making these statements that, around the China virus. He has a whole news network, Fox News, that is also amplifying and encouraging this viewpoint. And unfortunately, we have a longtime U.S. Senator from Texas, John Cornyn, saying really troubling things about, the origins, in his view, of the coronavirus. I do want to point out, and I'll get back to the hate incidents, in just a second. A lot of this rhetoric isn't just translating now into hate incidents. And as I mentioned, this historical pattern has kind of held true over time. We're also starting to see government policies, right? And the individual that you see in the lower corner, that gentleman works in the White House. His name is Stephen Miller. He has well-known ties to white nationalist groups and those sympathies. And he is the president's go-to person on immigration policy. And one thing that is well reported about Stephen Miller by several respected media outlets is his desire to not just decrease immigration, but legal immigration, and in particular to limit immigration from places like Asia. And I'll give you a few quick examples. One, the most recent, is this immigration pause, full stop. And he has expressed it, in his view, that would be something that wouldn't just be a temporary thing while the pandemic is going, but potentially a longer term thing. But we also know that they have fought really hard and tried to negotiate with the Democrats, and I'm glad it did not work out, is to trade a resolution for those receiving DACA, right, our so-called dreamers, in exchange, not just for a border wall, mind you, but for eliminating family-based immigration, right? And the reason I point that out is not just because my affiliation works on Value Our Families, which is a campaign to protect family-based immigration, but because an overwhelmingly large percentage of Asian Americans that immigrate to the US in the last decade have done so through the family-based immigration visa system. And so it is not an accident when we look at these this wish list from some of these individuals that they are pushing for these government policies in this time. As Dr. Guevarra said, a moment of crisis, rhetoric, hate incidents, policies. It's a very clear pattern. And so we want us all to be more aware of these things when folks like Congressman Casten speak out against it or stand up against it. We want him to understand that we know what's going on. We can see this pattern and we're not going to tolerate it, right? Now, I wanted to end with some good news because I think we can all use some good news these days. And so I thought, the two best ways that Asian Americans advancing justice view our role in responding to this moment are two things. One, it's really clear that our younger generation, maybe it's harder to get to some of these, older individuals that maybe have some deep-rooted prejudice, right? That's going to take some time, right? But we know certainly for our children and the younger adults that we still have an opportunity to maybe get them to see things a little bit differently about the Asian American community, maybe to rethink falling prey to this trend and this pattern of being used to divide our country, right? So the first thing is happy to announce in partnership with PBS, my affiliation had a strong role in the content that PBS will be premiering on May 11th and May 12th, a docu-series, a 5-part series called Asian Americans. And this documents basically the history of Asian Americans in this country from the late 1800s to very recently. And we think the timing is perfect because you will see during the course of the series these patterns play out, right? In different moments where the community, not just the Asian community, but all Americans came together to stand together against something that was just flat out wrong, right? And then there's moments where maybe America didn't do so great, right? And so we think those stories are really important for all of us to know, but especially for the younger generations to know, so that maybe we can recognize those things right now, disrupt them, and do better this time around. And then lastly, I think the last thing I would say is very soon, I hope by no later than June, we will be launching a series of bystander intervention trainings. For those of you that are unfamiliar with this, we want to see if we can train up enough individuals in the community, in your district, with tools by which if you saw Mr. Gu's incident in front of you, but you maybe were a little uncomfortable what to do, what to say, maybe you were worried about putting yourself in physical harm, especially given what Mr. Gu has shared about being struck. There are tactics that are proven by different training groups and have been seen to be effective for you to disrupt that hateful incident, maybe even de-escalate the situation without necessarily having to put yourself in harm's way. And so right now I'm talking to our DC affiliate that has been doing these trainings. We want to bring those to Chicagoland. We want to bring those to Illinois. We hope to be reaching out through the various networks, through Congressman Casten's office, I hope, to get that information once we have those trainings up and running. But the idea would be this isn't just in case you see a hate incident or verbal harassment of an Asian American. This would be anybody, right? Because I think we can all agree, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, wherever you are in the political spectrum, everyone should be treated with dignity. Nobody should be verbally harassed, and certainly no one should be getting physically attacked. And so this is our way of trying to equip everybody in the community to be a better neighbor to each other. And so hopefully folks will keep an eye out for that. And in the meantime, check out the PBS series. But thank you so much for having me. It's a very important conversation we need to keep having.
Thank you all. Oh, wait a minute. Can anybody hear me?
Now we can.
Oh, you guys couldn't hear me at all. I just saw that my thing popped up. I was muted. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, David. Thank you, Professor Guevarra. Thank you, Grant. We will keep this open a little bit longer if you guys can, because I know we ran a little bit late on the presentations. You guys have seen I've been writing here because I had these questions I wanted to ask and you kept answering them. So I had to keep crossing out. Bystander intervention is a great thing to do, and really appreciate you doing that. For those of you who have questions, click them in the chat. We'll open it up. I thought I'd just take congressional prerogative and put the first question out. Just before we sort of went into this whole COVID shutdown, I went down to Selma, Alabama with John Lewis, and we walked, went to the Montgomery bus station and met all these just heroes of the movement and our own civil rights era. And Brian Stevenson, who has built this just fantastic museum, and it's just a gut punch down there if you get a chance to see it in Montgomery. He pointed out to us while we were there, and he's of course said this very frequently in lots of public forums, that we have this weird sort of historical amnesia in our country. That he said, if you go to Germany, you'll see a gold star on the street, and it says, this is where something horrible happened in our history we need to acknowledge. If you go to Rwanda, you meet the Hutus and the Tutsis, they will tell you about their history they don't want to repeat. If you go to South Africa, as my daughter did on an exchange program, they'll take you to Robben Island and tell you about the history of apartheid and that they can't have that happen. And yet in our country, there's still a lot of people who say, no, the Civil War was about states' rights, wasn't about slavery, right? And we see it in these rallies that you're showing, where those, the iconography of hate all jumbles together, that you see a Confederate flag and a swastika waving together. What advice would you give, to our educators, to people who have, the public platforms of some stripe, to get us to come to grips with our history? We're not perfect. We're pretty good, but we struggle to acknowledge this history. And so much of what, these pictures you're sharing about the Chinese Exclusion Act, how many of us sort of sweep that under the rug because it's uncomfortable? How do we talk about that more effectively?
Well, Congressman, I'll
put that to anybody who's unmuted, because I'm sure they probably got you all muted.
Well, just really quickly,
whoever's on the background, it sounds like Andy's got something to say. They gave me unmuted.
I failed to mention this, but one of the things that will be coming out soon.
Raul or someone, you've got the. Can you unmute Andy?
Oh, can you all hear me? Okay. Okay. I mean, I think one of the things that I neglected to say that will be coming out very soon after, PBS has been very busy. They're fantastic, by the way, for those of you that don't watch public broadcasting.
People can hear them, that's great.
After the series comes out, they will also be releasing a K through 12 school curriculum. And so one of the things that we're looking to do, we know that for the state level, spring legislative session is not happening. But we are engaging Governor Pritzker and some of the state legislators about the possibility of making Asian American history part of the school curriculum for public schools. You know, it's a small step in the right direction as far as us being reminded of these stories, right? We know that, you know, certainly, David, I was at a talk with the Illinois Holocaust Museum. It is part of our school curriculum, along with the killing fields, which we have a sizable Cambodian community here in Illinois. These are important stories for our young people to know. And sadly, you know, it may be the first time that their parents hear of them, right? But we hope they bring their homework home and have that conversation with their parents too. And so is this an immediate near-term strategy? No, but I do think investing in us continuing to try to make sure that we are all equipped with our own history as we, you know, I think with the exception of, you know, some of the knuckleheads we've seen in the news, you know, I generally tend to think most Americans want our country to overcome prejudice and racism and to be more unified. And so, but we're trying to do that with only partial knowledge of our own history. And so I think that would be one tangible step that we can move in the right direction.
And I don't know if you can hear me. I think I'm unmuted because my thing's green. So, so what I would sort of add, I think just building on that, I agree completely with Andy. You know, we're often asked sort of why are we seeing such an escalation in hate? So, you know, with anti-Semitic incidents, I mean, we saw in the Midwest 110% increase in anti-Semitic incidents between 2016 and 2018. And in the upcoming weeks, we'll be releasing our 2019 audit, and it's not very good. From a numbers perspective, and so and then we're seeing the same thing in hate crime and in you know reported hate crimes by the FBI. You know, 2018 was a 10-year high in hate crimes, and so and this is at a time when this was before COVID, right? So when people were not necessarily saying we were in a you know in an enormous economic decline, and so that is something you know. So we look at sort of three things why we've seen such an increase in hate, which I think, and Andy touched on really the first one, that is ignorance, right? So how much do we know about our history? Do we keep to ourselves? Do we get to know one another and understand each other's histories and the differences and frankly realize that the diversity is our strength in Illinois? That's real important. The second we talk about is, I showed this technology, right? You know, long gone are those days where you have to find a meeting of extremists in the middle of the night. You can pick this thing up and you don't have to go to the deep dark web. As I showed earlier, people have access to this type of stuff. And so ADL, for at least on our perspective, we opened up something called the Center for Technology and Society in Silicon Valley, where we work with tech companies and showing them best practices on how to use user agreements to take down bad sites, to use the ingenuity of how we change the way we communicate with each other, that we can use those same algorithms that they use for marketing and advertising to suppress hate without stifling First Amendment and freedom of speech. And then the last piece is really sort of the civic and political discourse that's out there right now. The fact that we hear things that come out of elected officials kind of on all spectrums of the political aisle, political spectrum, is quite problematic, right? I mean, we've moved to a day and age where we communicate really complex issues in 140 characters or less, and that's a problem. And you know, I think how we can demand a culture of acceptance and diversity and inclusion is really important in schools, in government, in civil life, and civic society. Civil society is really important.
Thank you. Dr. Guevarra?
Yes. I wanted to build on what David and Andy also relayed earlier, and I really appreciate this question. I think one of the things that we've been working on in the Global Asian Studies program is developing a set of teaching resources that educators can use, and it's and I can forward the link later, but what we've done is to think about this particular moment as a teaching moment and as a way to connect what is happening with Asian American communities to a larger project of racial justice. And so the resources that we've developed compiles a number of scholarly materials, work that is being done by grassroots organizations like Advancing Justice. It has a compilation of kind of tracking the incidents of hate that is taking place, so that we can kind of start to have an archive of what is happening at the moment, but be able to perhaps construct a teaching tool that can be used in not only in universities, but also perhaps high schools and even kindergarten. So if we can continue to collaborate on these kinds of projects and continue to work and kind of fill the gaps that we might have in terms of our histories, but also connecting those histories as a larger project of racial justice, I think that would be a very effective way to start, kind of really figuring out what we can do and what actions we can take.
So I know we've got a couple questions in the queue, and we're, like I said, we're at our past our allotted time. But why don't we try to get to a couple of the questions that are in there, and as long as you guys will still humor us and sticking around for another few minutes.
Okay, James commented on a recent incident in Algonquin Township where the township highway commissioner used the term Chinese virus. What can be done when an elected official uses racist terms, and how can this incident be brought to light?
Want to go first? Me too, Andy.
Sure. I think, I talk so my organization has a series of a number of grassroots community organizers, and we talk about accountability of our elected officials, right? But I think we also want to be careful about call out culture, right? Give people somewhat a benefit of the doubt that have that conversation with that elected official, right? They may not realize how harmful those words actually are, right? So at least give them that good faith attempt to apologize, to maybe correct themselves, and I hope would never use that term again, right, after that conversation, before maybe putting someone on blast completely and saying they should resign and never hold office ever again, right? Now, that may end up being, I don't know this individual, that may end up being the appropriate response, may or may not. I would defer to the local folks in that community, but I think let's try to have conversations with people in this moment, right? Like, because I think the other side, they want people to be divided. They want people yelling at each other and screaming at the top of their lungs. And so, again, I love the way the Congressman framed this conversation. What's the loving response to someone who maybe just doesn't quite have it right? Let's give them, let's take that chance. Let's be a little bit brave and engage them in a conversation. And if they're not listening at that point, they are an elected official, and elections are basically the consequences of whether you feel that they have done a good job and represented your community in the way that you would like to see them do so.
So Andy, you took the words out of my mouth, but I would just tell you, as as someone who is an elected official and is new to this line of work, you often find yourself speaking to large groups of people, sometimes groups of people that have totally different life experiences than you. And if there's anyone in this line of work who hasn't sometimes said something where someone pulled them aside afterwards and said, like that really wasn't, and that's part of the job, right? But I would say don't let it lie either, right? Because there's a tendency, if we don't demand accountability, we can't complain if people aren't accountable. And so, so my advice would be, imagine if you were sitting at Thanksgiving dinner and a family member who you really loved and respected, made a racist joke. Do you let it lie? Or do you say, hey, grandpa, grandma, like, that's kind of not cool. Like it offends me. Oh, by the way, here's a personal story. This is why it would, and you deal with it respectfully. And maybe they apologize and tell you thank you for bringing them into the 21st century. Maybe it gets a little awkward, but they think twice about it the next time. And we change the space in which people communicate, because there's a whole lot of things that, when, I think all of us can probably think back to language that was common as recently as when we were in high school. that you would never get away with now, right? Because cultural standards change, and they change because individuals stand up and say, we're gonna lead with love, but we're gonna make sure the love's kind of loud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you both said it perfectly. We often talk about intent versus impact also. And so I think the idea of speaking out against when those things occur, and then but then also understanding intent versus impact too, and making sure people realize that you might not have intended to have a particular impact, but let me tell you what the impact that you have.
Oh, no, we don't all need to answer every one of these because I know we got a bunch in the queue.
Yeah,
I don't mean to cut you off, Professor Guevarra, but why don't you go ahead? What's the next one we got in there?
William has asked how we can respond when we see hate online, but without trolls retaliating against us by engaging in doxing and hacking.
It's a really great question. One of the things that I would say on the just doxing and hacking, first of all, ADL's launched a new campaign. We were instrumental 20, 30 years ago in getting hate crimes laws passed around the country, and there's now 45 out of 50 states that have strong hate crimes laws. We're now going online. We call it backspace hate, and trying to make sure that we've got swatting and doxing laws, anti-swatting, anti-doxing laws on the books around the country. Illinois has decent laws, pretty good. But I think one of the things that we have found is certainly calling it out, but when things that are really offensive to, a lot of social media platforms, at least the mainstream ones, are now moving to a situation where you have the ability to flag and report these types of comments, and we would encourage you to do so. And you can do it anonymously. You can do it in a way that protects your identity and responds to it. It is a new tool, and I won't go. I'm happy to talk about what doxing is and swatting is, if anybody wants to know. But there are new mechanisms, at least on a lot of social media platforms, largely because of the work of ADL and other organizations that allow you to do that. And then the other piece of it too is I would encourage all of you to actually, you can visit adl.org and you can join our Backspace Hate initiative and encourage elected officials to make sure that states have strong anti-doxing and anti-swatting laws on the books. That's a really important tool to use.
I want to just make two comments on this. The first is to be a little bit careful on social media. There's a huge problem with bots and things that are designed to amplify hate, and they exist to provoke. Use a good program when you see that. More often than not, run Bot Sentinel or one of those programs out there, and you'll find it's a robot and just mute it. They go away. They are taking advantage of social media algorithms that if you respond, they get amplified and then they zoom up in the algorithm. So think seriously about whether you're engaging with a real person before you engage. And remember that, unfortunately on social media, things that trigger emotional responses algorithmically become more viral. And so just think a little bit about what you share. The second thing, and this is a larger issue, and I'd encourage you to go to our website and you'll see a letter I wrote to all the social media companies. There's a real problem that we have, and I don't have an easy answer to this, but we need to acknowledge at a regulatory level and with social media companies on what it means, what free speech means in a digital era. We all know there have been Supreme Court cases that says you can't yell fire in a crowded theater because you'd put hundreds of people's lives at risk. Well, if you have millions of social media followers and you engage in hate speech, you're putting more people's lives at risk and health and well-being. But we don't quite have those rules yet. And what you'll find on our website is I sent a letter to all the social media companies basically saying, can you put an authenticator function that says this is true or this is not true, because there's evidence that people share that. You have algorithms that decide what to boost. You could tweak your algorithm to cover this. And it came out of when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying before the Financial Services Committee on which I sit. This was it was a different era. We were very worried about cryptocurrency at the time. But I put the question to him and I said, suppose that a member of the American Nazi Party wanted to set up a Facebook page and spread their ideology. Would you shut that down? He said, no, that would violate all our terms of service. You'd shut it down. You can find this all in C-SPAN. I said, okay. Now suppose that a member of the American Nazi Party won the nomination to be the Republican candidate in Illinois' 3rd district running against Dan Lipinski in 2018, which is true. And he wants to say the same things. Just stipulate. I'm not saying he did. I'm saying just stipulate that he did. Would that be covered as unregulated political speech under your terms, or is that hate speech? And Mr. Zuckerberg said that's really complicated. I have to look into the particulars. And I said it's not complicated. It's the same question. And there's this conversation we really need to have, and we have to have it individually about what we share. We have to have it with these companies that because they have such massive platforms, we either have to expect them to self-regulate, which frankly they're not doing a very good job of, or figure out what kind of regulation we're comfortable with. Because as people more eloquent than I have pointed out, many for a long time, there's a fundamental conflict at the heart of our founding documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and entitled to the right to pursue liberty. Liberty and equality are not always in agreement with each other. The Civil War was fought over whether some people could have the freedom to extinguish others' equality. The Cold War was fought over whether total equality could be done to extinguish individuals' freedom. There's a tension. There's no one right side to that, but we have to balance it, and the balance is, I would submit, a little bit off kilter right now.
I have one final question from Barbara before we ask for final comments. Barbara's concerned that most participants on this webinar are sympathetic to one another. How can we reach a broader audience to help people understand what is going on and how we can work together for the greater good?
We all jump in at once. I would say this. I alluded to my own faith background. I have brothers and sisters at church or that I've done church with that are quite conservative politically, right? I wouldn't say we start out talking politics. That's probably not where we start out. We were usually complaining about the Bears or something safer about that, like that. But I think it's going to be very challenging for us to engage folks with very different views on issues like this without some other way to connect with that person and have a relationship. If we're thinking we're just going to cold walk up to someone and engage them and have an effective conversation, they don't know you, you don't know them, that's going to be really challenging. And so I think one of the things that I would really encourage us all to think about are what are places or opportunities, whether it's service opportunities or different places where you might actually get out of your bubble, your own political bubble, right? Not everyone is watching the same news or consuming the same books or what have you, but you're actually putting yourself in a space where people might come from different backgrounds, rather than it being the only reason you're there, like I'm there to convert people away from hate, just get to know people, right? Be more rooted and engaged in your community, and hopefully those opportunities will organically happen, and you'll know when you have those moments where you can make the brave choice of stepping out and maybe engaging in a slightly more challenging conversation. But I don't know that if walking into a ultra conservative space with the intent of trying to convert everyone in that room is maybe going to be the most effective way, but certainly on a one-on-one level it can be done. Yeah.
Well, go ahead, David.
Oh, no, what I was going to add too is, one of the things that we try to do in ADL education and training, different training programs, and we do it a lot with law enforcement through what we call our managing implicit bias training for law enforcement, really is coming to terms with biases that we all have. We're human beings, we have them. It doesn't make us bad people, but recognizing that we have them and what they may be actually challenges us internally to become better people and to understand what those are and how we approach different people in different situations. And I think that that's an important element to getting to know people and making ourselves vulnerable and overcoming some of those ignorance and addressing some of those issues that Andy raised.
Dr. Guevarra, you have anything you want to add on that?
I do. I really appreciate that question. I think stories matter, personal stories matter. And I think as people start to share, how particular, experiences of hate and injustice is impacting them, and to the extent that that can be shared as stories to a broader audience, I think that helps. In the classroom is a very important space to have these conversations. I will have to say that not all of my students believe in the same values that I believe in, or see themselves as, having any voice in injustice. So a lot of the work we do in the classroom is trying to, help them reframe conversations and ask different questions. So I think for educators who are in these kinds of spaces, I think the classroom is a very important space to have very difficult conversations. So that would be one thing I'm thinking about.
So I just make kind of a pessimistic comment and an optimistic comment. The pessimistic comment is that we've, as I think a lot of our speakers have pointed out, there's a historical pattern here that's been going on for thousands of years. That when there are times of stress, when people feel like they don't have the ability to pursue happiness, they're held back. Sometimes we are blessed to have great leaders who rise up and say, you know what, we're all in this together. We're all going to get through it together. And I can think of leaders, let's cross the aisle. Abraham Lincoln is a Republican who said, with malice towards none and charity towards all. George W. Bush, who after 9/11, stood there and said, this is absolutely not about Islam. The Ronald Reagan in his farewell address, when he said, the day we stop welcoming immigrants to America is the day we stop being Americans. They didn't say that because they were Republicans or anything else. They said that because they understood that in times of stress, we are stronger when we rise up together. There have also been throughout our history, and you can think of all the names, people who've said in times of stress, the way I am going to accumulate personal power is by telling people who are troubled that the cause of their troubles are people who don't look like them. It's what Hitler did. It's what Osama bin Laden did, right? It's what George Wallace did, right? To find examples from our own history. And I think our challenge as individuals is that that's always there, but to take some optimism from the fact that we do still live in a world where nothing makes a racist angrier than calling him a racist. And I say that with a certain amount of optimism because and maybe this is just I'm still a entrepreneur and a sales guy at heart. I used to have to tell all of our engineers turned into salespeople that people don't buy things for logic. People buy things for love, but they need reasons to rationalize their purchase. And I think that's equally true of like who we decide to vote for, what party we decide. We don't decide that for rational reasons. We have emotional reasons and reasons of our family history or other things that resonated with us. We need reasons to rationalize them though. And I think there is always a place in history for people who appeal to our better angels. And if you don't see someone appealing to people's better angels, it's on you. On you to step up and make that appeal. Well, hey, I thank you all so much for your time. I thank you all for allowing us to run over a little bit. For those of you who might have had some questions we didn't get to, hopefully it's more than offset by the fact that we just had all this terrific content. So thanks for doing what you do. Thank you, Grant, if you're still on. Sorry about the audio connection. Keep on keeping on. Hopefully we won't have to do this again. But again, lead.
Congressman, if I may,
Yes.
would like
Yes.
just to make one last comment.
Yes, go ahead.
As I mentioned earlier, I lived in Naperville since 1991, and this is possibly the only instance that remotely related to, shouldn't say remotely, it is related to violence and discrimination. I have, and I still consider this is rare occasion, and I hope we all do things to keep it that way. And I do want to thank you and your team to have this event. And I learned a lot from the presentations of the others. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. Be well, be safe, and hopefully see you soon, maybe even in person.
Thank
Good night, everybody.